The grand ballroom of the Chicago Plaza Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers. Men in expensive suits and women in designer dresses moved around like colorful fish in a fancy tank. In the middle of it all stood Alexander Whitmore, looking at his watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes. "Another hour," he whispered to himself. "Just smile for another hour, then you can leave." At 32, Alexander was used to these charity events. As the heir to Whitmore Global Industries, a company worth billions, showing up at fancy parties was part of his job. Tonight's event was raising money for medical research, and his family's foundation was the main sponsor. "Alex, there you are." His mother's friend, Mrs. Patterson, approached with her daughter in tow. "You remember Rebecca, don't you? She just finished her MBA at Harvard." Alexander nodded politely. This happened at every event, someone trying to introduce him to a suitable young woman from their social circle. He chatted for a few minutes before excusing himself to get a drink. At the bar, he loosened his bow tie slightly. "Scotch, neat," he told the bartender. "I'll have the same," said a voice beside him. Alexander turned and saw a woman in a simple but elegant dark blue dress. Her hair was styled in neat braids pulled back into a bun, and she wore minimal jewelry, just small diamond earrings that caught the light when she moved. "Rough night?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Is it that obvious?" Alexander smiled. "Well, you've checked your watch about 20 times since I noticed you, and you look like you'd rather be anywhere else." She accepted her drink from the bartender. There was something refreshing about her directness. "I'm Alexander Whitmore," he said, extending his hand. "Dr. Zora Johnson," she replied, shaking it firmly. The reluctant guest of honor. Alexander's eyebrows shot up. "You're Dr. Johnson?" "The neurosurgeon." "The very same." She took a sip of her scotch. "Though I'd much rather be in my lab than here talking about it." "I thought you'd be," he trailed off. "Older? Male? White?" Zora challenged, though her tone remained light. Alexander felt his cheeks grow warm. "I was going to say surrounded by admirers. Your research on neural regeneration is groundbreaking." Surprise flickered across her face. "You've actually read my work." "Just the articles in Scientific American," he admitted. "But it's fascinating. The idea that we might someday help stroke victims regain full function." For the next 20 minutes, they talked about her research. Alexander was surprised by how easily he followed her explanations. She had a gift for making complex ideas understandable without talking down to him. "So that's why we need the new imaging equipment," she concluded. "If we can see the neural pathways forming in real time, we can better understand how to encourage regrowth." "That's what tonight's fundraiser is for," Alexander realized. "Your equipment." Zora nodded. $3 million worth of it. "Well, as the main sponsor, I should probably make sure you get it," he said with a smile. Her expression changed. "Wait, Whitmore, as in Whitmore Global Industries? That Whitmore?" "Guilty as charged," he said, used to this reaction. People always treated him differently once they realized who he was. Some became overly friendly, others nervous and awkward. But Zora just shook her head. "And here I've been boring you with technical details all night." "Not boring at all," he assured her. "Actually, this is the most interesting conversation I've had at one of these events, possibly ever." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide if he was sincere. "Well, Mr. Whitmore." "Alexander. Please." "Alexander," she corrected. "Since your family is funding my research, I suppose I should show you what you're paying for." "I have some images on my phone from the lab." They found a quiet corner away from the main crowd. As Zora showed him photos and videos from her research, Alexander found himself less interested in the images and more captivated by her enthusiasm. When she talked about her work, her eyes lit up and her hands moved expressively. "Sorry," she said after a particularly detailed explanation. "I tend to get carried away." "Don't apologize," he said. "It's refreshing to meet someone who's genuinely passionate about something meaningful." Their conversation flowed from her research to their backgrounds. Zora had grown up in Southside Chicago, the daughter of a high school teacher and a nurse. She'd won scholarships all the way through medical school and had fought hard for every opportunity. "And what about you?" she asked. "What's it like growing up knowing you'll inherit an empire?" No one had ever asked him that question so directly before. Instead of being offended, Alexander found himself giving an honest answer. Lonely, he admitted. Everything's planned out for you. The right schools, the right friends, the right career path. And the right wife? Zora asked with a raised eyebrow, glancing toward Rebecca, who was watching them from across the room. Alexander laughed. Exactly. The whole package deal. And you don't want that? He considered her question. I want to earn something on my own merit, not just inherit it. I want something real. He met her gaze. Like what you have with your work. The evening passed in what felt like minutes. They barely noticed as the crowd thinned and the event staff began clearing tables. Dr. Johnson called an older man in a tuxedo. Your car is here. Zora looked surprised. It's that late already. She gathered her small purse. I should go. Early surgery tomorrow. Of course. Alexander felt strangely disappointed. It was a pleasure meeting you, Dr. Johnson. Zora, she corrected with a smile. She hesitated, then pulled out a business card. If you're ever curious about how your family's money is being spent, you're welcome to visit the lab. As she walked away, Alexander looked down at the card in his hand. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something new, something unexpected. He didn't realize he was still smiling until his driver asked him if he had a good evening. Yes, Alexander said, tucking the card carefully into his wallet. I think I did. 3 days after the charity gala, Alexander stood outside the University Medical Center, holding a coffee in each hand. He checked the text message from Zora again to make sure he was at the right entrance. He felt strangely nervous, like a college student before a first date, not the confident businessman who regularly closed multi-million-dollar deals. Alexander? Zora appeared, wearing blue scrubs under her white lab coat. Her hair was pulled back in a practical style, and she wore no makeup. She looked even more beautiful than he remembered. I brought coffee, he said, offering her one of the cups. I wasn't sure how you take it, so I got some cream and sugar packets just in case. Black is perfect, actually. She took the cup with a genuine smile. I'm surprised you actually called. I'm a man of my word, he said. And I'm curious about your work. Zora led him through security and into the elevator. I just finished a 6-hour surgery, so I hope you don't mind if I multitask and check on my patient while showing you around. The neuroscience floor was busy with doctors, nurses, and medical students rushing from room to room. Several people greeted Zora with clear respect as they passed. Dr. Johnson, a nurse, called out. Mr. Chen is awake and responsive. All his preliminary tests look good. That's wonderful news, Tina, Zora replied, her face lighting up. She turned to Alexander. Mr. Chen had a tumor that most surgeons wouldn't touch. Too risky. But I used a new technique we've been developing. As Dora talked, Alexander watched her face. The passion in her eyes when she described saving someone's life made his own work feel empty in comparison. What had he done lately except increase profit margins by a few percentage points? After checking on her patient, a middle-aged man who looked at Zora like she was an angel, they continued to her research lab. This is where the magic happens, she said, using her ID card to open a heavy door. Inside, researchers in lab coats worked at stations filled with equipment Alexander couldn't name. And this, she said, leading him to a large machine in the corner, is what your family's donation paid for. Our new imaging system. For the next hour, Zora showed him around, introducing him to her team and explaining their work in simple terms. Alexander asked questions that made her look at him with growing respect. Most people's eyes glaze over after 5 minutes of this stuff, she admitted as they left the lab. It's fascinating, he said truthfully. What you're doing here, it matters. They ended up having dinner at a small restaurant near the hospital, Zora's favorite place after long surgeries. It wasn't the type of establishment Alexander usually frequented, with its plastic menus and paper napkins, but the food was delicious and the conversation even better. That dinner led to another, and then another. Soon, they were seeing each other several times a week. Alexander found himself making excuses to stay in Chicago rather than flying back to New York for board meetings. On their 5th date, he took her sailing on Lake Michigan. As the boat glided across the water, Zora told him about growing up on the South Side. My parents worked so hard to give me and my brother opportunities, she said, trailing her fingers in the order. My dad would take extra shifts at the school, coaching basketball and tutoring, just to save money for our college funds. They must be very proud of you, Alexander said. Zora nodded. They are. My mum brags about her doctor daughter to everyone at church. She looked at him curiously. What about your parents? Are they proud of you? Alexander adjusted the sail before answering. They're proud of the Whitmore name and what it represents. I'm not sure they see me separate from that. 2 weeks later, Zora took him to the community clinic where she volunteered every Sunday. Alexander felt out of place in his designer clothes, but soon found himself rolling up his sleeves and helping organize medical supplies. You're full of surprises, Whitmore, Zora said, watching him play peekaboo with a toddler waiting for his mother's appointment to end. Good surprises, I hope, he replied. She kissed him in answer, right there in the middle of the busy clinic. As spring turned to summer, their relationship deepened. Alexander started looking at properties in Chicago. Zora introduced him to her parents, who were initially wary but warmed to him when they saw how he looked at their daughter. They had Sunday dinners at her family's modest home, where Alexander learned to play spades and enjoyed home cooking that put his favorite restaurants to shame. Your family is amazing, he told Zora as they drove back to her apartment one evening. There's so much love in that house. What about your family? She asked. When do I get to meet them? Alexander's grip tightened on the steering wheel. They're complicated. My father is very traditional. The company has been in the family for 4 generations, and he's big on legacy. And I'm not exactly what he had in mind for carrying on that legacy, Zora said quietly. It doesn't matter what he thinks, Alexander insisted, taking her hand. I've never felt this way about anyone before. You challenge me, Zora. You make me want to be better. That night, as they lay together in her bed, Alexander whispered, I love you for the first time. Zora's eyes glistened in the dim light as she whispered it back. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a text from his father. Board meeting moved up. Your presence required terminaro, non-negotiable. Alexander showed Zora the message. I have to go back to New York for a few days. Go, she said, kissing him. Handle your business. I've got 3 surgeries scheduled this week anyway. What neither of them knew was that a photographer had captured their kiss outside the community clinic. The picture was already on its way to Winston Whitmore's desk, along with a detailed report on Dr. Zora Johnson. As Alexander packed for New York, he made a decision. It was time his family knew about the woman he loved. He had no idea of the storm that was coming. The Whitmore family estate stood on 10 acres of manicured grounds just outside New York City. As Alexander's car pulled through the iron gates, he felt the familiar weight settle on his shoulders. The house ahead looked more like a museum than a home, with its stone columns and perfect symmetry. Welcome back, Mr. Whitmore, said the housekeeper, taking his coat. Your father is waiting for you in his study. Alexander had planned to freshen up first, maybe gather his thoughts before facing his father, but that wasn't going to happen now. He straightened his tie and headed down the long hallway. The study door was slightly ajar. He could hear voices inside, not just his father's, but his mother's and uncle's too. Strange for a supposedly routine board meeting. He knocked once and entered. The conversation stopped immediately. Alexander, his father said, not rising from behind his massive oak desk. Right on time for once. Winston Whitmore I was in his 60s but looked 50, with only hints of gray in his dark hair. His mother Eleanor sat primly on a leather sofa, while his uncle Richard stood by the window. I thought the board meeting was tomorrow, Alexander said. His father gestured to a manila folder on his desk. Something more pressing came up. Alexander sat in the chair across from his father. What's going on? Winston opened the folder and turned it toward Alexander. Inside was a photograph of him and Zora outside the community clinic, his arms around her waist, their faces close together. Can't to explain? His father asked. Alexander felt a flash of anger. You had me followed. We have a security team that monitors potential threats to the family, Richard cut in smoothly. Standard procedure. Threat? Alexander's voice rose. She's a neurosurgeon, for God's sake. Alexander, darling, his mother said softly. We're just concerned. You've been skipping important meetings, spending weeks in Chicago. I'm seeing someone, Alexander said firmly. Her name is Dr. Zora Johnson. She's brilliant, kind, and I love her. The words hung in the air like smoke. His mother's hand went to her pearl necklace, a nervous habit she had since he was a child. Love, his father repeated flatly. After what, 2 months? 3, Alexander corrected. And yes. Winston sighed and pulled out more papers from the folder. Dr. Zora Johnson, graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins. Promising career, several published papers. Grew up in South Chicago, father a teacher, mother a nurse. He looked up, very impressive by all accounts. For a moment, Alexander felt relief. They'd done their homework and could see how exceptional Zora was. But utterly unsuitable as a match for a Whitmore, Winston continued. The relief vanished. Unsuitable? Based on what? Be reasonable, son, Richard said. Our family has certain traditions, expectations. If you're talking about her race, Alexander started. This isn't about race, his father interrupted sharply. It's about background, about understanding our world, the responsibilities that come with the Whitmore name. Your father's right, dear, Eleanor added. It's not fair to bring someone into this family who doesn't understand our obligations, our lifestyle. Alexander stood up. You haven't even met her. We don't need to, Winston said. The board is concerned about your recent distractions. Shareholders are asking questions about your commitment to the company. Shareholders? Alexander laughed bitterly. Since when do shareholders care about my personal life? They care when the future CEO seems more interested in playing doctor in Chicago than attending critical strategy meetings, Richard said. Winston leaned forward, his voice softening slightly. Son, you've worked hard to prove yourself worthy of taking over the company someday. Don't throw away everything you've built for a passing infatuation. It's not an infatuation, Alexander said through gritted teeth. Perhaps not, his father conceded. But ask yourself this, what can you really offer her? A life of being scrutinized by the press, of being whispered about at every social event, of never truly belonging. The words hit Alexander harder than he expected. He'd been so caught up in their happiness that he hadn't fully considered what his world might look like through Zora's eyes. The company needs stability right now, Winston continued. The Asian expansion is at a critical stage. We need the board's full confidence, and that means you focusing on what matters. Zora matters to me, Alexander said quietly. His mother stood and crossed to him, placing a hand on his arm. No one's saying you need to end things immediately. Just think about what's at stake, for everyone. Alexander left the study feeling like he couldn't breathe. He needed air, needed to think clearly. He walked out to the gardens where he used to play as a child. His phone buzzed. A text from Zora. Just finished a successful surgery. Miss you. How's NY? How could he possibly answer that? Fine, family stuff. Miss you too, he typed back. Later that evening, during a tense family dinner, Alexander's phone rang. It was Zora, which was unusual. She normally texted during her hospital shifts. Excuse me, he said, stepping away from the table despite his father's disapproving look. Alexander. Zora's voice sounded strange. Something weird happened today. What's wrong? The head of neurology called me into his office. Apparently, there are concerns about my research funding. She paused. The major donor is threatening to pull out. Alexander felt cold. Which donor? They wouldn't say exactly, but it's the Robinson Foundation. The Robinson Foundation was a Whitmore shell company used for certain investments and donations. His family had moved fast. That doesn't make sense, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I'll look into it. There's more, she said. I've been getting strange calls. Someone asking about my relationship with you, about my family. A reporter showed up at the clinic yesterday. Alexander closed his eyes. I'm so sorry, Zora. This is my fault. What's happening, Alexander? She asked, her voice small. My family, they know about us. They're not happy. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that Alexander checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. I see, Zora finally said. And the funding? The calls? Is that them too? He couldn't lie to her. Probably. What are we going to do? She asked. Alexander looked back toward the dining room, where his family waited. "I'm coming back to Chicago tomorrow. We'll figure this out together, I promise." What he didn't tell her was that his family had made it very clear this was just the beginning of what they were willing to do to keep a Whitmore from making what they considered a mistake. Alexander paced outside the hospital boardroom, checking his watch every few minutes. Inside, Zora was defending her research project to the ethics committee, a meeting that shouldn't have been necessary. Her work had already been approved twice. When the doors finally opened, Zora emerged looking exhausted. The other doctors filed past, a few giving her sympathetic glances. "How did it go?" Alexander asked, taking her hand. "They're requesting additional oversight," she said quietly. "And they want monthly progress reports instead of quarterly ones." "That's not standard procedure." "No, it's not." Zora squeezed his hand. "But I'll manage. Let's not talk about it now." They walked to her office in silence. Over the past 3 weeks, the pressure had been building from all sides. Alexander had returned to Chicago as promised, but the problems had only multiplied. In her office, Zora sank into her chair. "I got another call from that reporter today. He asked about my diversity scholarship from medical school, implied I didn't earn my spot." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I'll have my lawyer send a cease and desist. And that will just make it look like I have something to hide." She rubbed her temples. "3 of my patients have requested transfers to different doctors, no explanation given." Alexander kneeled beside her chair. "This is wrong. All of it. Is it really your family? Could they really reach this far into my life?" He couldn't lie to her. The Whitmore name opens a lot of doors, makes a lot of people eager to help, even without being asked directly. His phone buzzed, another email from the company's financial officer. He ignored it. "What about you?" Zora asked, nervousing. "What's happening on your end?" Alexander had been trying to shield her from his own troubles. "Nothing I can't handle." "Alexander," she said firmly, "we agreed to face this together. No secrets." He sighed. "They've restricted my access to some of the company accounts. Routine projects are being reassigned. The apartment I was looking at in Chicago suddenly isn't available anymore. They're trying to pull you back to New York and isolate you here," he added. "Classic divide and conquer." That night, they had dinner at Zora's apartment, takeout eaten on her small balcony. The summer air was warm, city lights twinkling around them. "We could just leave," Alexander said suddenly. "I have my own money, separate from the family. We could go anywhere, London, Tokyo, Sydney." Zora looked at him sadly. "And abandon my patients, my research, everything I've worked for. Would you really be happy walking away from your company, your future?" He didn't answer. They both knew it wasn't that simple. The next morning, Alexander received a call from his cousin Thomas, who worked in the company's legal department. "You need to know what's happening," Thomas said, voice low. "They're preparing to have you declared temporarily unfit for your position, citing emotional distress and erratic decision-making." "They can't do that without a board vote," Alexander argued. "They've been working the board for weeks. Uncle Winston has been having private dinners, calling in favors." After hanging up, Alexander called his own lawyer, a college friend who had never taken a dime of Whitmore money. The news wasn't good. "They can't push you out completely," the lawyer explained. "But they can sideline you for months, maybe longer. And if they control your finances during that time." Alexander understood. They were going to starve him out, cut off his resources until he fell back in line. Later that week, as they walked through the park near Zora's apartment, a familiar car pulled up alongside them. The window rolled down to reveal Alexander's mother. "I need to speak with you," Eleanor said, not acknowledging Zora. "Alone." "Anything you need to say, you can say in front of Zora," Alexander replied coldly. Eleanor's perfect composure slipped for just a moment. "Very well. Your father has had a minor heart episode. He's fine, but the doctor recommends reducing stress." Alexander felt a stab of concern despite everything. "When?" "2 days ago. He didn't want you to know." She finally looked at Zora. "Family pride, you understand." The implied message was clear. Your relationship is literally making your father sick. "I should go see him," Alexander said, torn. "He's at the Connecticut house resting." Elena handed him a card. The doctor's information if you want to speak with him directly. After she drove away, Zora turned to him. You should go. It could be another manipulation. Or it could be true. He is in his 60s, under stress. She touched his face gently. He's still your father, Alexander. The next day, as Alexander packed for Connecticut, Zora received an email from the hospital administration. Her request for time off to present at an international conference had been denied. The same conference where she was supposed to reveal her groundbreaking research results. This is too much, Alexander said when she showed him. I'm calling my father directly. No, Zora stopped him. If we fight every battle, we'll burn out. I can publish the results without presenting them. But they both knew what this meant. Without the presentation, her work wouldn't get the attention it deserved. Years of research would be noted and filed away instead of celebrated. That night, after Alexander had gone to Connecticut, Zora's phone rang with an unknown number. Dr. Johnson, a smooth, unfamiliar voice said. This is Richard Whitmore, Alexander's uncle. I think it's time we had a frank conversation about what's best for everyone involved. Zora's hand tightened on the phone. I'm listening. I admire your resilience, Doctor. Truly, but you must see that this situation is untenable. Alexander is sacrificing everything, his family, his future, his birthright. And for what? A relationship that will always be under scrutiny, always facing obstacles. If you're calling to threaten me— Not at all, Richard interrupted. I'm calling to make you an offer, the kind that could secure your research for decades to come. All we ask in return is that you consider what's truly best for Alexander. As Zora listened to the offer, tears filled her eyes. The choice being laid before her was impossible, but perhaps it was also inevitable. Rain pounded against the windows of Zora's apartment. She sat curled on her couch, staring at her phone. Richard Whitmore's offer echoed in her mind: full funding for her research for the next decade, a state-of-the-art lab under her complete control, and a position at any hospital of her choosing. The price? Walk away from Alexander. Make him believe it was her choice. It's better this way, Richard had said. A clean break. Let him hate you rather than his family. He'll come back to us eventually, and you'll have everything you need to help thousands of patients. 3 days had passed since that call. 3 days of barely sleeping, of questioning everything. Her phone lit up with Alexander's name. He was back from Connecticut. Hey, she answered, trying to keep her voice normal. I'm on my way over, he said. We need to talk. Something in his tone made her heart sink. Is your father okay? He's fine. The heart episode was indigestion, conveniently mistaken for something worse. His bitter laugh hurt to hear. Another manipulation. I'm sorry I fell for it. 30 minutes later, Alexander arrived soaking wet from the rain, his face a storm of emotions. Look at this, he said, pulling up a news article on his phone. The headline made Zora feel sick. Whitmore Hare's girlfriend. Merit or diversity hire? The article questioned her qualifications, suggested she'd advanced through special programs, and implied Alexander was involved with her out of some misguided social justice mission. It's in 3 different publications, Alexander said, pacing. All owned by companies where my father's golf buddies sit on the board. Zora set the phone down. Alexander, stop. Just stop. He looked at her, confused. What? I can't do this anymore. The words felt like glass in her throat. We can't do this anymore. What are you talking about? I know it's bad, but we can fight this. My lawyer thinks we can sue for defamation. And then what? Zora stood up. Another article. More pressure at the hospital. More threats to your position in the company. Alexander came to her, took her hands. We knew it would be hard, but we can handle it together. Zora pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. Richard's advice echoed in her mind. Make it convincing. Make it final. I thought I could handle it, she said. But I can't. Do you know what it's like, having people whisper that I didn't earn my position, that I'm just riding on diversity initiatives or sleeping with a rich white man for advancement? Nobody who knows you believes that garbage. But they're thinking it. Zora's real frustration gave her words power. Every time I walk into a patient's room now, I see the question in their eyes. Every time I stand up in a meeting, I feel colleagues wondering if I belong there. That's exactly what my family wants, Alexander argued. They want to wear us down, make us doubt ourselves. Well, it's working. Zora's voice broke. I've spent my entire life proving myself, fighting twice as hard to get half as far. My work is all I have. You have me, Alexander said softly. Zora turned away so he wouldn't see her tears. For how long? Until your family cuts you off completely. Until you resent me for costing you your birthright. I don't care about any of that. You say that now. She forced herself to turn back to him. But in 5 years? 10? When you're teaching at some university instead of running your company? When I can't practice medicine because your family has blacklisted me at every decent hospital? Alexander looked stricken. I would never let that happen. You can't stop it. That's what you don't understand. This part wasn't an act. Your family will always have more power, more influence than we do. So we just give up? Let them win? The betrayal in his eyes was almost unbearable. We be realistic, Zora said. I need my career, Alexander. I've worked too hard to lose it all. And you were born to run that company. It's in your blood. I don't accept that. He reached for her again. There has to be another way. She stepped back. There isn't. I've thought about this for days. The smart thing, the right thing, is to end this now, before we destroy each other's lives. This isn't you talking, Alexander said, voice hard. This is my family. What did they offer you? Zora had prepared for this question. Nothing I accepted. But they made me see the reality of our situation. Reality? Alexander laughed bitterly. The reality is I love you. I thought you loved me too. Love isn't always enough. Zora blinked back tears. Sometimes it's just not enough. Alexander stood there, rain dripping from his coat onto her floor. The silence stretched between them like a canyon. I don't believe you, he finally said. Something else is going on here. Zora had to end this before her resolve crumbled. She thought of her patients, of all the lives her research could save with proper funding. She thought of Alexander, cut off from his family and legacy. I can't be what your family wants, she said, voice flat. And I'm tired of trying. I'm tired of fighting. So this is it. After everything, you're just giving up. I'm being practical, something you wouldn't understand with your privilege. The words hit him like a slap. She'd never thrown his wealth in his face before. My privilege, he repeated slowly. I see. It's better this way, Zora said, echoing Richard's words. A clean break. Alexander stared at her for a long moment. You know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe my family was right all along. Maybe we are too different. Zora felt something breaking inside her chest. This was what she wanted, for him to walk away angry, to go back to his world while she stayed in hers. So why did it feel like dying? I should go, he said, moving toward the door. Alexander, she started, not sure what she was going to say. He paused, hand on the doorknob. For one breathless moment, she thought he might see through her act, might refuse to leave. Goodbye, Zora, he said without turning around. The door closed quietly behind him. Zora sank to the floor, finally letting the tears come. She'd done what Richard asked. Alexander would hate her now, would return to his family, would eventually take his place as CEO. And she would have her research funding, would save countless lives, would never have to worry about hospital politics or budget cuts again. So why did it feel like she'd made a terrible mistake? Outside in the rain, Alexander sat in his car, unable to drive away. Something wasn't right. The Zora he knew would never give up like this, would never throw his privilege in his face. There had to be more to the story. He pulled out his phone and called Thomas, the only family member he still trusted. I need you to find out something for me, he said when his cousin answered. I need to know exactly what my uncle offered Zora Johnson. As the rain beat against the windshield, Alexander made a decision. He wasn't walking away. Not yet. Not until he knew the whole truth. 6 months passed like a blur. Alexander sat in his corner office in the Whitmore building, staring out at the New York skyline without really seeing it. A stack of contracts waited for his signature, but he couldn't focus. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. Your mother is here to see you. Alexander sighed. Sent her in. Eleanor Whitmore entered, elegant as always in her designer suit. You missed Sunday dinner again, she said, sitting across from him. I had work. It wasn't exactly a lie. Work was all he did these days. The Reynolds girl was there. Lisa, her father says you haven't called her since your dinner last month. Alexander didn't reply. He'd gone on exactly 3 dates in the past 6 months, all with women his parents had selected. None had lasted beyond a polite dinner. Darling, it's been half a year, his mother said, her voice softening. You need to move on. I have moved on, he said flatly. I'm back in New York. I'm running the Asia expansion. I'm doing everything father wanted. Elena studied her son's face. You're not happy. Does that matter? His mother flinched slightly. Of course it matters. We're your family. We want what's best for you. Alexander finally looked directly at her. No, you want what's best for the Whitmore name. There's a difference. After she left, Alexander pulled out his phone and opened the photo he couldn't bring himself to delete, Zora laughing on the boat that day on Lake Michigan, her face lit by sunshine. According to Thomas, she'd left Chicago 3 months ago, accepted a position at London's top neurological hospital. Her research was progressing well, fully funded by an anonymous donor, the Robinson Foundation. His family had kept their word at least. They'd given her everything they promised. Alexander put the phone away and turned to his computer. He opened a document labeled Whitmore Foundation Scholarship Initiative. It was his secret project, a foundation providing full scholarships to minority students in medicine. He'd set it up through shell companies his family couldn't trace back to him. It wasn't much, but it was something. A way to honor what he'd lost. 5,000 miles away, Zora stood in her new lab, surrounded by state-of-the-art equipment. A group of eager medical students watched as she demonstrated the neural imaging technique she pioneered. And here, she said, pointing to the screen, you can see the neural pathways beginning to regenerate after treatment. The students murmured appreciatively. That's all for today, Zora concluded. Remember your research papers are due next Friday. As the students filed out, Zora's assistant approached. Dr. Johnson, your 2 o'clock cancelled. And this came for you. She handed over a thick envelope. Inside was an invitation to speak at an international neuroscience conference in New York. Zora's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been back to the States since leaving Chicago. Will you accept? Her assistant asked. I'll think about it, Zora said. But she already knew she would go. Her work deserved to be shared, no matter how painful returning might be. That evening, Zora walked to her apartment through London's drizzly streets. The city still didn't feel like home, despite her beautiful flat and prestigious position. Inside, she made herself tea and opened her laptop. Her brother had sent photos of his new baby, her niece, born last month. Zora smiled at the tiny face. She'd yet to meet the baby in person, another sacrifice in a long line of them. Almost without thinking, she opened a private folder on her computer. Inside was a single document, a letter to Alexander she'd written the night after their breakup. A letter she'd never sent. She read it sometimes when the loneliness became too much. The words were a reminder of what she'd given up and why it had been necessary. I wonder if you hate me, she'd written. I hope you do. It would be easier that way. Easier than knowing you still love me while we're forced to live these separate lives. Zora closed the laptop. The conference in New York was in 3 weeks. There was almost no chance she'd run into Alexander in a city of millions. Almost no chance she'd have to face the pain she'd caused them both. The next morning, Alexander sat in a board meeting, half listening as Richard presented quarterly projections. His uncle had been insufferably smug these past months, clearly believing he'd won. Alexander's phone vibrated. A text from Thomas. Found something. Need to talk ASAP. After the meeting, Alexander met his cousin in a coffee shop 4 blocks from the office, far enough that they wouldn't run into colleagues. What's so urgent? Alexander asked, sitting down. Thomas glanced around nervously. I've been digging into Uncle Richard's communications like you asked. It wasn't easy, but I finally got access to his private email account. And I found correspondence with the Board of London Memorial Hospital from 6 months ago. He personally arranged for Zora's position there. Alexander frowned. We already knew that, part of their deal. Yes, but then I found this. Thomas slid a printed email across the table. from 3 weeks before you and Zora broke up. Alexander scanned the email. It was from Richard to the head of neurology at Zora's Chicago hospital, mentioning concerns about her research methods and suggesting a review of her department funding. He was sabotaging her before you even went to Connecticut, Thomas said, before he made her the offer. Alexander felt cold anger building inside him. He was creating the problems he then offered to solve. Classic Uncle Richard, but there's more. Thomas pulled out another paper. This is from the Robinson Foundation's records, the funding for Zora's research. It has conditions. If she has any contact with you, all funding gets pulled immediately. She loses her lab, her position, everything. Alexander stared at the document, pieces falling into place. She didn't leave because she wanted to. She left because they gave her no choice. It looks that way. Thomas agreed. And Alexander, there's one more thing. Dad and Uncle Winston don't know about these conditions. This was all Richard's doing. On the way back to his office, Alexander stopped at a newsstand. A medical journal caught his eye. Zora was on the cover, captioned Pioneer in Neural Regeneration. He bought it, flipping to the feature article. At the end of the interview, she was asked about her move to London. Sometimes we have to make difficult choices for the greater good, she was quoted as saying. My work has the potential to help thousands of patients. That has to come first. Reading between the lines, Alexander finally understood. She hadn't rejected him or their love. She'd sacrificed it for her patients, for the lives she could save with her research. His phone buzzed again. An email from his assistant, International Neuroscience Conference schedule attached as requested. Alexander had almost forgotten. He was giving the opening address as the Whitmore Foundation was the main sponsor. He scrolled through the list of speakers and suddenly his heart stopped. There, scheduled for the second day, Dr. Zora Johnson, London Memorial Hospital, Breakthrough Techniques in Neural Pathway Regeneration. For the first time in 6 months, Alexander smiled. In 3 weeks, they would be in the same place. And this time, he had the truth on his side. Back in his office, he called the family lawyer, not Richard's man, but the original Whitmore counsel who had known Alexander since childhood. I need everything you have on the Robinson Foundation, he said. And I need to make some changes to my opening address for the neuroscience conference. The game his uncle had been playing was about to end. But first, Alexander had to prepare for the most important reunion of his life. The conference hall buzzed with activity as doctors and researchers from around the world gathered for the International Neuroscience Conference. Alexander stood at the podium, adjusting his tie nervously. His opening speech was scheduled to begin in 5 minutes, but his eyes kept scanning the crowd. Then he saw her. Zora sat in the middle of the audience, reviewing her notes. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, and she seemed thinner, but still breathtakingly beautiful. Alexander's heart raced as he remembered what he was about to do. Ladies and gentlemen, the moderator announced, please welcome our opening speaker, Mr. Alexander Whitmore. The crowd applauded politely. Alexander approached the microphone and took a deep breath. Thank you for that introduction. I was supposed to talk about the Whitmore Foundation's commitment to medical research today. But instead, I want to talk about integrity. A murmur ran through the audience. In the third row, Alexander spotted his uncle Richard shifting uncomfortably. 2 years ago, my family established the Robinson Foundation to fund groundbreaking research. Today, I'm announcing the complete restructuring of that foundation. Alexander's voice grew stronger. All current grants will continue without conditions or restrictions. Researchers should never have to choose between their work and their personal lives. Zora's head snapped up, her eyes finding his across the room. Additionally, I'm establishing a new board of directors comprised entirely of researchers and doctors, not business people with agendas. Alexander smiled slightly. And finally, I'm stepping down as CEO of Whitmore Global Industries to focus on ethical philanthropy full-time. Gasps echoed through the hall. Richard was on his phone now, likely calling Winston. Thank you for your time, Alexander concluded. The detailed announcement is in your press packets. I look forward to a future where brilliance is supported without strings attached. As Alexander left the stage, chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions, attendees buzzed with speculation. He ignored them all, making his way directly to where Zora sat frozen in her chair. "Hello, Dr. Johnson," he said quietly. "Alexander," she whispered. "What did you just do?" "What I should have done 6 months ago." He held out his hand. "Can we talk somewhere private?" In a small meeting room away from the crowd, they faced each other for the first time since that rainy night in her apartment. "I know about the conditions on your funding," Alexander said. "I know what my uncle did." Zora's eyes filled with tears. "You weren't supposed to find out. Why didn't you tell me?" "What good would it have done?" She wiped her cheeks. "Your family made it clear they'd destroy both of us if I didn't leave." "Not my family, just Richard." Alexander stepped closer. "He acted almost entirely alone. My father didn't even know about the conditions he placed on your funding." Zora looked stunned. "But he still disapproved of us." "Yes," Alexander admitted. "But after I showed him what Richard had done, something changed. He realized how far his brother was willing to go to control the family legacy." "And now you've given up that legacy," Zora said. "Your position, your birthright." Alexander shook his head. "I found something better. A chance to do real good like you do. And maybe," he hesitated, "a chance to start over, if you want that too." Zora looked into his eyes, searching for the truth. "Your family will have to accept my choices or lose me for good. That's the deal I made with my father." "And he agreed?" "Let's just say nearly losing me once was enough." Alexander took her hand. "I spent 6 months trying to forget you, Zora. I can't do it anymore." She intertwined her fingers with his. "I still have my lab in London. London has excellent coffee shops where an ethical philanthropist could work remotely," he replied with a small smile. For the first time in 6 months, Zora laughed, that full, genuine laugh he'd missed so desperately. Outside, reporters waited and questions loomed. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But as they held each other close, one thing was clear. This time, they were facing the future together on their own terms.